And welcome to the Cult Cinema Circle podcast. My name is Jesse, and I'll be your host. So on today's episode, we're going to head over to the novelty shop to go find a spooky mask for Halloween. We're going to head to Eda Grove Cemetery and scare Chuck and Steve, because they deserve it. But we're also going to try and find the symbol of love that we all need to find in order to be able to accept ourselves and be able to love ourselves. But on today's episode, we're going to be covering and celebrating, really, a truly wonderful piece of horror media. That is Goosebumps, The Haunted Mask from 1995. Now, I would like to wish everybody that is listening a very, very happy Halloween. You are hearing this on the day of Halloween, so keep it spooky, bitches. I must say, I've talked about how, Carrie was one of the first horror movies I saw and how it had such an impact on me and all these things, right? So, of course I did. But let me tell you something. This piece of media, truly, is kind of my horror root, if you will, to borrow terminology from the movie But I'm a Cheerleader. This is where I really started in terms of loving horror and being obsessed with it, really. And so I thought, what better way to really to honor this wonderful piece of media than to cover it on my show? Why not? This is something where it's deeply within my bones of just, I've seen this episode quite a bit of this television show, which is obviously just iconic in its own way. This also, I think, is a piece of TV, history that was so important for a lot of people who ended up becoming, horror fans in their later years. And we'll talk about all that kind of stuff during the course of our episode today. This is just something where it is the perfect amount of 90s cheese, but also there's a certain level of heart to this as well, and I am just so happy to be covering it. So I hope you are too, and I'm just so happy to be able to talk about this. And I've got a good amount of stuff to talk about in this particular episode. So as we normally do, we're gonna and this is also the first piece of TV that we're doing as well. I would love to maybe also do episodes on other types of TV stuff as well, especially when it has a cult following in a way, which also TV can have too, which is really cool. But anyway, this is first spooky season, of course. But as we normally do on the show, we're going to go over some of just the baseline figures of the movie, the piece of film that we're covering today, which is what I consider it. But we're going to talk a little bit about just Goosebumps as a whole, how it came to be, how did the TV show come about, and then also dig into the story and also, just talk about it and shoot the shit because it's Halloween, bitch. Why not? But without further ado, let's move on to some production history, a little bit about Goosebumps and all that good stuff. So before we talk about just the Haunted Mask in general, right, I think it's important to talk a little bit about just how Goosebumps came to be, and that's a whole lot to get into. But we're going to start simply with a gentleman by the name of Robert Lawrence Stein, who's also known as Jovial Bob Stein or Eric Affabee, apparently. Now, this guy would be known to all kids as the Stephen King of horror, but he is known as R.L. Stein. So a little bit about R.L. Stein. He is from Columbus, Ohio. He was born in 1943, and pretty much he became, a writer. He grew up in a Jewish family, and he began writing at the age of 9 when he found a typewriter in his attic, and he began to type stories and joke books. And he remembers reading Tales from the Crypt comics when he was young, and he credits that as one of his inspirations. And so he went to Ohio State University in 1965, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English. And while at OSU, he edited humor magazine, The Sundial, for about 3 years. He then later moved to New York City to help pursue his career as a writer. R.L. Stein, under the name Jovial Bob Stein, he wrote dozens of humor books for kids under that name, and he also created the humor magazine called Bananas, and this was written for teenagers, and it was actually published by Scholastic Press for 72 issues between 1975 and 1984. Plus, he did various, quote, yearbooks and paperback books, and he was the editor and responsible for much of the writing of these things. Some of his features he did was called Hey, Lighten Up, It Never Fails, Phone Calls, Joe, which was a comic strip by Joel Holstrom, who is, again, he was also in this kind of scene as well. Apparently that guy worked for High Times, which is kind of fun. Yeah, so he just had all these different, like, things he was doing as a comedy writer, really. He was just writing humor. But in 1986, he wrote his first horror novel called Blind Date. And so he also followed up with many other novels, including The Babysitter, Beach House, Hit and Run, and The Girlfriend. And also for 90s kids out there who might be interested, and if you didn't already know this, he is actually the co-creator and the head writer for the Nick Jr. show, Eureka's Castle, which was from 1989 to 1995. So anybody who watched Eureka's Castle back in the day, that was actually also created by R.L. Stine. But in 1989, he began writing the Fear Street books. Now, nowadays, we know Fear Street as a 3-part movie series on Netflix, but they were books back in the 80s. And so before launching the Goosebumps series, though, he authored about 3 humorous science fiction books in what was called the Space Cadets series, which was titled Jerks in Space, Bozos on Patrol, and Losers in Space. And so in 1992, Stine and Parachute Press went on to launch Goosebumps. So that's like the basic idea of like how that came. But let's get a little more granular than that, just a little bit of just some history with that. But that's like the basic idea of how this came to be. So really it started off with these little horror novels he did, and then he did Fear Street. And so because of Fear Street, that really kind of solidified him being able to make Goosebumps, I guess, really. I mean, there's not too much to talk about with Fear Street, really. It was just kind of a different demographic, honestly, is what it seemed like. So really, it always these books always took place in the fictionalized town of Shadyside, and really just had like average teenagers older than like the Goosebumps preteens, who would encounter malignant, sometimes paranormal adversaries. And while some of the Fear Street books had paranormal elements such as ghosts, a lot of more of them were just murder mysteries. Whereas the Goosebumps books had a few tamed deaths. A lot of the deaths that are in Fear Street were far more gruesome with more blood and gore. And it goes into this whole thing of, the Fear family and all this kind of stuff going into it. I mean, again, you're not coming here for a Fear Street podcast, but, this is pretty much, the basis of what he did. But when it came to actual Goosebumps, though, he had already worked with Scholastic to make Fear Street, right? So he had already been doing that. And so really falls under the Goosebumps story as a whole, though. So these books, they really just fell under, horror and thriller and things like that. But really he characterized them as scary books that are also funny. And really this was more so a lot of his... really more so like preteen type stuff. That's really what it was. So according to the documentary Tales from the Crypt, from comic books to TV, R.L. Stine said that he's remembered reading the popular or infamous, like I said, Tales from the Crypt comic books. And so books and characters in the series were inspired by books and films. So like, for example, Slappy the Dummy was inspired by Pinocchio. The piece of media we're talking about today, The Haunted Mask, was actually based off of when his son Matt had trouble getting a Halloween mask off of his face one year, and so he really just ended up writing these stories that he, really a lot of his themes were just like children triumphing over evil, and also children just facing horrid or frightening situations and using their own wit and imagination to really escape those. But yeah, I mean, the co-founder of Parachute Press, who was Joan Waracha, she persuaded him to write scary books for younger kids. And so yeah, and Goosebumps actually kind of came from an ad in TV Guide where apparently this TV station had its Goosebumps week on Channel 11. So he initially signed a 6-book deal with Scholastic, but he went on to write 6 62 books in the original Goosebumps series, the first of which was Welcome to Dead House in July of 1992. The series apparently was originally aimed at girls, but both boys and girls actually enjoyed the series equally, with half of Stein's fan mail being sent from boys. And so, of course, also these cover illustrations of these books are pretty lit too. A lot of them were done by Tim Jacobus. And of course, like, iconic, amazing. But honestly, following the release of the first novel, these really became popular, though. They sold 1 million copies a month soon after they first arrived, and 4 million copies a month by the mid-90s. And really, it's kind of hard to describe to people who maybe weren't there. But honestly, like, when you think about it, these books this is before Harry Potter. So, like, Harry Potter is kind of known as, like, the big, best-selling children's book of all time and things like that. But, Goosebumps was there before, bitch, okay? Let's not get it twisted, okay? It was 15% of, like, Scholastic's annual revenue by, like, 1996. So that's a big deal, okay? There's a lot riding on that. But yeah, I think for sure, like, this was just something where it was that Harry Potter of its day, really. I just think, like, this book series for so many people, really, I mean, it honestly is just so... I think what's so big about it and what's so important about this in particular is really, and I want to talk a little bit about this. So when it comes to these books, I'm not a parent or anything like that. I'm not an uncle or an aunt. No, I'm kidding. No, but no, I'm not an uncle or anything either. But when it comes down to it, as somebody who grew up loving horror, right? This was a way for me to get that adrenaline and be able to have that kind of a different view of, literature and all this kind of stuff. And if you're interested as a kid, if you're interested in horror, it doesn't mean anything bad. Really, it could just be that you like that stuff, and maybe you grow out of it and maybe you don't. It kind of depends. I myself didn't grow out of it, but I think that, a big part of this too is that, Goosebumps especially, it was a very challenged as a book series. If you haven't already seen it, there is it's a nice little documentary on YouTube, or you can find it on Freevee or something like that, but it's on YouTube. It's called, I think it's called Scary Stories, but what it is it's actually a documentary that is about the scary stories to tell in the dark books, which were also very big as well back in the 80s, really, which are by Alvin Schwartz. And this documentary you can find, it actually has like his son in it, and it has like other people as a part of this, and they all talk about like their experience with this particular documentary, or with this particular book series of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which were also fabulous. But anyway, so with Goosebumps, though, it was also a huge thing of like the fact that you have something where this is challenged because, it's too scary for kids. So, kids don't, they shouldn't be exposed to this kind of stuff because, it's too scary for them. It'll give them nightmares, all that kind of stuff, whatever, right? And that's a fair point. Like, I'm not going to deny that and disagree with it. However, I will say that there are plenty of kids who also just really like that stuff. You know what I mean? And who's to say that we shouldn't have that for kids, that is age appropriate, especially for something like Goosebumps that is fairly age appropriate. You know what I mean? And really, when it comes down to it, I know people are afraid of mortality and death and things like that. Funny enough, Goosebumps isn't really even about death or dying, really. Scary Stories definitely kind of had that sort of thing because it was death and dying. But people are so scared about mortality or like whatever, but you're gonna have people who pass on in your life, I mean, and it sucks, but it's one of those things you can't always shield your kid from that. At some point their grandparents are gonna die, and maybe one of their parents will pass away at a young age, or whatever, that kind of thing. And so it's one of those things where we're so precious about certain things, but it's like, well, these are sometimes part of life. It really is part of life. And I think horror for kids, like, is a totally fine thing. That is exactly why you have, you know, a book series and TV show like Goosebumps. That is why you have something like even Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, you know, and also why you have something like Are You Afraid of the Dark, you know, and these are things that are targeted to kids that are so important because it then sets somebody up to then be interested in the horror genre and the thriller genre, if you will, where it then can inspire them of like, wow, I really love these things and I maybe want to pursue that or whatever, you know, and so many, you know, there's obviously examples of like Stephen King or like, you know, Elvira or like whoever who kind of grew up maybe liking spookier things or whatever it is, but that is because that's part of it. Like, you know, you grow up liking funny things and you want to make people laugh and you want to become an actor or comedian or whatever, you know, and hey, yeah, maybe if you like Tales from the Crypt comics and Vault of Horror and those kinds of things, it's no surprise you then become like a horror novelist or you become like a horror film director or a horror film actress or like any of these kinds of things. Yeah. I do also want to mention too, so in that documentary that I talked about, there's a great little part that I'm going to insert here actually. And it talks about book banning, and I'm going to get into that as well. But listen to this little excerpt that I have for this, and then we'll talk about it.
There were many cases of school boards debating whether to keep Goosebumps in the school library or not. And I'm happy to say that in most cases, the books were kept on the shelves. Most. There was a wonderful, now it was in Minnesota, I think, where a school board was going to take all the Goosebumps books away from their schools. And it was on C-SPAN.
William W. Garrison, Franklin.
And a father stood up and he had a big stack of Goosebumps books.
My name's Bill Garrison. My daughter goes to Franklin. I'm unable to read to her for the simple fact that I'm a single parent and I had no time to read for her. So with these Goosebumps collection that I have here, which I have not seen one tonight, encourage her to read. And if they're taken off the shelves, then I'm afraid she's going to lose interest to read and going to end up like me without a decent job because of no education.
I want her to be able to read what she loves. I'm home in tears, right? Watching this guy. I'm like, it was amazing.
If the kids choose to read them, more power to them. If their parents don't choose to have them in the home, more power to them. I'm one for to keep them on the books.
So I hope you like my little insert from that little documentary. I must say, like, I really love how simple that, you know, guy's kind of rationale behind this whole, you know, thing with book banning, you know, where this parent that I just, you know, inserted the clip about, you know, really, he just wanted his kid to be better than him, you know what I mean? Which I think a lot of parents obviously want. You want your kid to turn out better than maybe you did or whatever, right? And so, like, just the fact of, like, hey, look, like, if these books, you know, make my kid want to read and make them interested in reading or whatever, then, you know, I'm not that worried about, like, you know, I'm not that worried about what the content is all the time. Especially something like Goosebumps, where it's really like these books, yes, they are scary, quote unquote, but honestly, like, for a kid who's interested in that or who wants that kind of a thing, they're tame, obviously. They're made for kids. So, I mean, and of course, like, you know, so they do talk to, in the same documentary, they talk to one of the parents from the 80s, who actually, you know, kind of had this, was kind of a crusade, who had a crusade on these, like, trying to get these scary storybooks to get out, you know, to get them off the shelves or whatever. And, you know, it's so sad too, when I think about it. We'll get back to the Haunted Mask in a minute, but it's so sad to me that, like, you know, we still have book banning today, you know, I mean, and even probably it's even a little worse now, because now it's like, I remember I was watching a YouTube video about something and it came up with book banning or whatever. And something like the Cider House Rules was, like, banned out of schools because, well, spoiler alert for Cider House Rules, it deals with a, quote, doctor who performs abortions, actually. And so, but the thing is like, But that is like one part of that story. There's a lot of different things. There's also a movie with Tobey Maguire and Charlize Theron. But like, I mean, that's one part of the story, right? But like the fact that, oh no, we can't talk about abortion. Oh, we can't talk about any of that stuff. We got to take it away from the kids or whatever. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, are you kidding me? Like, if I would think a middle school probably has Cider House Rules because it's really just a book. Like, it's not anything, whatever. But like the fact that like you ban that shit, it's like, what the hell is wrong, man? Like, what is going on here? But it's crazy that it really hasn't. It hasn't really changed that much. I feel like it only has changed so much. With just like how you want to censor books and the content to books and all these things, when really what it sounds like to me is like, when it comes down to it, parents and shout out Barbie, for my Jurassic Park episode, but she has 2 young kids, but the thing is like, you as a parent in general, like, you have to be aware of what your kid is watching or what they're reading or whatever, so you can determine if you feel like it's appropriate for them, and that is your job as the parents, not the fucking library's job to be like, we have to censor everything, you know what I mean? No, if you don't want your kid reading Goosebumps, fine, don't have it in the house maybe, but don't then say they oh, all the books should be gone now. Oh, all these Goosebumps books need to be gone because I don't think my kid should be reading this because blah, 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 blah. That's so fucking dumb. Like, it's stupid. But like, anyway, that's my soapbox, because I could go on and on about that. Also check out Judy Blume Forever, because Judy Blume is also a bad bitch. I have not watched the Are You There, God It's Me, Margaret movie yet, but I do want to watch it. Judy Blume is also a bad bitch because she, similarly to R.L. Stine, has had to also deal with like just people trying to ban her books because she wanted to talk about real shit. And I'm all about, talk about real shit, you know what I mean? So like, yeah, I definitely wanted to get a little bit on about just like book censorship and like that kind of shit, because it's hard not to talk about that when it comes to Goosebumps, because it is a challenged book series, and it was a challenged book series at the time. I just think it was important to mention that and talk about it a little bit. But yeah, I mean, and then because this book series became so popular, they ended up making a TV show of it, of course, which we all know and probably love if you're listening to this particular episode, listener. But yeah, I mean, and so the way that TV show really came to be was honestly because they obviously went to Canada to go shoot it, because tax freaks, baby. Okay, it was mostly done in Ontario, Canada, with different houses and historical properties in Toronto, Markham, and other outlying rural areas that were obviously the sets for each episode. So yeah, they just ended up doing a lot of that. Props for the series were designed by Ron Stefanik and Alan Duchette, while Stefanik retained many of the animatronic props in his own studio after they canceled Goosebumps, unfortunately. But yeah, so Goosebumps actually started airing on YTV, which is kind of like the children's TV. It's like sort of like the Nickelodeon of... it's the Nickelodeon pretty much of like Canada, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. So it started airing there and on Canal Famille in French in Canada as well. And so then, but at Fox Kids is where it started in... because back in the day, there was a Fox Kids block that would show on Saturday mornings or whatever, and you could watch things like Goosebumps. And then, of course, also Netflix does technically have this still on their roster. They don't have all the episodes, though, because they took down a couple of those. They only have the specials now, because I think they're trying to get it for, like, I don't know, they're trying to get it for Disney or something like that, because they are making a show that is called Goosebumps that is going to be on Hulu and Disney Plus and things like that. So, interesting. Anyway, so, but I mean, that's a little bit about just that particular show and all of that. I mean, it's a popular book series, so similarly to how the Harry Potter movies came out, this became a popular book series that then ended up, spawning this popular TV, movie series. And a lot of things did that, I mean, shit, 13 Reasons Why was a book series. It was I think it was a book series or a book or whatever. And then they turned it into a Netflix series. Orange is the New Black. That's another one that they did. It took one book and turned it into a literal TV show. Heartstopper technically is a graphic novel and turned it into there because nothing is original anymore. Anyway, but yeah, so but that's really, it was no surprise that they would end up turning Goosebumps into a TV show or anything like that. But, we were talking about, we talked about book censorship and we talked about like Goosebumps and how it came to be as a show and all that kind of stuff. But let's get a little more specific about the Haunted Mask in particular. So I found this information that I'm pulling from about the Haunted Mask and the TV show of Goosebumps in general from a little website called conventionalrelations.net, and it is a article that is talking about the oral history of Goosebumps, the television series, which was posted in August 20th of 2020. So they talk about how, this is a book series and everything like that. But we have a few characters in this particular story. So we have Steve Levitan, who is a producer, who was quoted in this article. Also, a couple different people. So like Timothy Bond, who we'll get to in a minute. We'll get to him. Amos Crawley, who plays Chuck in The Haunted Mask 1 and 2. And Catherine Long, who plays Carly Beth in Haunted Mask 1 and 2. And all that. And we also have a little bit of Ron Stefanik, who I just talked about. He was the pretty much creator of the creatures and the puppeteer of a lot of these things. But Steve Levitan is quoted as saying, in the late 80s and early 90s, he was running a production company that produced a TV series called My Secret Identity with Scholastic. And so after his contract with that company was up, he started his own company called Protocol Entertainment. And so he flew to New York and he met with the people at Scholastic to talk about new projects. And so at this point, they were telling me that they had this new which was called in those days chapter books, flying off the shelves. It was called Goosebumps, right? So they gave them they gave him a few of the books, and they called he called them when he got back to Toronto. He said, "Let's make this a TV series. Let's make this a thing." So Steve Levitan is kind of a force to thank for Goosebumps, the TV show. He's quoted, their first response was, "I don't think we can make a deal with you because Fox bought the movie rights," which of course then in 2015, they actually ended up doing the actual movie of Goosebumps. But it turns out they did not buy the TV rights though. So oddly enough, once we got the TV rights, Fox Kids Network was our broadcaster in the States, as opposed to YTV that was in Canada. So in these days, technology was not what it was today. The television, business for kids was not what it is today. The idea of making a TV series based on an anthology series of books where every episode has different characters, different locations, different monsters, different animals, for the TV production business, that's very expensive to shoot. And he thought he was the only one whose plan was to make it a live action show rather than animated. And that's I think that's what persuaded R.L. Stine. So a little bit of Stefaniak. So he talks about, he's quoted as saying, he went into his interview and he didn't have really the biggest portfolio, but he had a unique one. His team didn't do just makeup and gore and zombies. Their backgrounds were a lot wider in the sense that they did animatronic puppets. They did like Muppet style puppets. They did giant creature suits. So when they looked at the covers of the books, it was clear that the show was going to need a range of odd characters. And so that's why he got the job, was because he went in to pitch it. He said a lot of these people might come into this work thinking that you'll be lucky to have them. And if I were you, I'd hire someone who could kill themselves to impress you every day. I would go out of my way to make sure you never regret that you hired our company. So then it was important to like make a distinction between this show and Are You Afraid of the Dark, which was equally popular on Nickelodeon, which was also done in Canada. But Steve Levitan had a fantastic writing team, which was led by Billy Brown and Dan Angel. Now, if you don't know who they are obviously the guys who wrote a lot of the Goosebumps episodes based off of the books. But also, they're the same guys who actually wrote the movie, the horror anthology, Body Bags from John Carpenter, which I have mentioned on the podcast plenty of times. I love that little horror movie. It's great. It's very accessible too. You can find it on Shudder. You can find it on Tubi, I think. Like, it's really easy to find. So please go watch Body Bags. But the guys who wrote that actually ended up writing a lot of these Goosebumps episodes. They were the heart and soul of the show. Their deal with R.L. Stine gave him the right to approve or reject any script based on first drafts. And he started going through all the books published up to that point to figure out which could be successfully adapted into a TV show, and not many of them could. So then we have Ron Oliver, who he was doing Are You Afraid of the Dark at the time in Montreal, and Fox called him and said if he wanted to do Goosebumps. And he flew from Toronto and he met with the executive producer, Deborah Forte, who worked at Scholastic, and they were trying to define the difference between Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps. And there was a specific tonal difference. So, as many of you may know, but like Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark were in the same genre. But Goosebumps always had an ironic, humorous, tongue-in-cheek, self-consciousness that Are You Afraid of the Dark didn't have. And they're glad they went in that direction because I don't think there would have been enough room for two completely similar shows. Which I think is fair. Totally fair. So they talk about like casting kids and stuff like that. So Steve Levitan talks about how the talent pool of adults was really easy because they didn't have much to do. It was really finding kids to do it. So these main characters were 12 years old, or they had like an 8 or 9 year old brother or sister. So 12 is a hard age to work with. The best directors would find a way to have the kids say the lines the way that they really say them, and instead of acting them. You don't want acting chops. You want kids who aren't going to be spooked by the camera and can also be themselves. And there were some of them who were naturally talented and super bright. And some of whom have gone on to have like cool careers. Ryan Gosling being a very good example of this, where he was on both of those shows, Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps. But, and he's now Ken. But like, but yeah, plenty of people. I mean, like John White was another one. He's in The Haunted Mask 2. And he plays Steve in that. But yeah, I mean, you have Catherine Isabel was in an episode of Goosebumps, like you have these people who have actually been able to make careers for themselves in just being an actor, that also started off on this little TV show, which I thought was really cool. And of course, like R.L. Stine said in 2015, he said, we used every Canadian kid there was. It was a totally Canadian production, and he would do book signings in the States. Kids would ask, like, hi, I'm an actor. How could I be on the Goosebumps show? And he would always say, you have to be Canadian. And every time the kid would say, what's that? Which I thought was kind of fun. But yeah, I mean, that's super fun and cool. And I think really the heart of the Haunted Mask in particular, because they do talk about in this article, the Haunted Mask in specific, I think a really big part of this episode is really just the performance of Miss Catherine Long, who, if I'm not mistaken, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I guess. Catherine, come on the show. But I believe Catherine Long is actually a stage name for this lady, as also with Catherine Short, who plays Sabrina in this episode. I think that was also like a stage name for both these people. So their actual names, maybe her actual name is actually Catherine, but like, who knows? But she was quoted in this, so they somehow got her, which was cool. She says she honestly doesn't remember much of her audition. They auditioned a lot of girls for the role, went in for a few callbacks, and they narrowed it to 3 people before she got it. And it was a little bit before, Ed, she even says, there you go, Catherine Long, if that is your real name. Goosebumps was a little bit like the Harry Potter of the 90s. It really was. But she wasn't really into it. She didn't realize how big it was. And after she got the part, she got a huge set of the books and started reading them. As you should. They also talked to Chloe Sevigny. Wow. Chloe Sevigny. They talked to Corey Sevier from A Night in Terror Tower, who has also gone on and had a little career for himself. And he talks about like Catherine Short as well. I'm not really going to go into that because it doesn't talk a ton about that. Anyway, but yes, so there was like all the kind of fun things of like, oh, the long and short of it, because they are in 4 episodes in total together because they did the sequel too. But yeah, and they also talk in this article about how they met Ryan Gosling too, which is really funny. But yeah, of course. Anyway, talk about the Haunted Mask though. So, they started off in the summer of 1995, and it would be the 1-hour primetime special, The Haunted Mask, which is what we're talking about today. So Goosebumps is very unusual, Steve Levitan is quoted as saying, because there was no pilot. Once they got the rights to do the TV show, there were a number of broadcasters that wanted to pick it up. They didn't want to see a pilot, they just wanted to go right into production. And it's really unusual for a show to just go right into production like this. But because you have millions and millions of kids reading your books, you would think, okay, they don't need a pilot, people want this. And Amos Crowley, who plays Steve, who plays Chuck in these episodes, he remembers being aware that they were sparing no expense as when it came to kids TV. So kids TV didn't generally have a huge budget, and the Haunted Mask today might look a little cheesy by today's standards, but at the time they were really putting money into it. He seems to recall that there was a TV exec from Fox whose kid loved the books, so much so that she thought it was an important project. Timothy Bond as well, he talks about how one of the neatest things about this whole experience was meeting R.L. Stine, because he hardly talked to adults. He spent a lot of time with kids because he himself is a parent technically too. So like, and he knows that this is for the kids. So that's very important. Everyone talks about how he has sort of like a Stephen King quality to him, which makes total sense. And how he's actually a really super nice guy and super, super cool. But this really relied on the performance of its lead actress, Catherine Long, who that was important to have a good actress with this. And she had a little bit of a career before this. She actually got nominated for what was called a Gemini Award, which is pretty much like a Emmy Award in Canada. She got nominated for that, for her performance. She didn't win, though, but that's okay. I mean, I'm not bitter for her. I might just be a little bit bitter for her, but it's whatever. It's fine. Anyway, but they talk about how like the mask was put on her skin. They made a mold of her whole face. It was pretty much like a life face mask, if you will. They put two straws in her nose and covered her whole face in plaster. And it was like made specifically to her skin, which I thought was really crazy and interesting. But yeah, and like Stefaniak, he talks about how they sculpted her mask. Each guy in the shop was told to sculpt a mask for the scenes in the costume shop, so they had the different masks that were there. It wasn't written in the script, but they decided to base each one of the haunted masks on the 7 deadly sins. They were all made of soft prosthetic foam, and because foam shrinks when it's finished cooking, it fits the head quite snugly. And in the part of the episode where it sucks to her head, they just put air bladders into the mask and deflated them, and it stuck to her face. And then they went in and they glued around her eyes and put artificial gums and teeth onto her lips. So it was only about 2 or 3 hours that she was really in makeup, which wasn't terrible. But yeah, Catherine Long talks about how she would cry because it was hard getting like all this shit off of her face pretty much. And, she was shooting all night too, which was probably crazy as well. It's just kind of gross and weird. But whatever, it's fine. And R.L. Stine apparently really liked her too. Thought she was a real trooper, and she never complained about it, which I thought was really cool. And also, Catherine Long talks about how Tim Bond was the best director. Gave her so much freedom. How like they were going to dub over her voice, but she actually had done some voice training. So she's like, oh, I want to maybe try, maybe we can do it. And they ended up, I guess maybe to save themselves some money a little bit, is also they just used her voice for this particular character. And then, of course, in the beginning of the show, there is a scene where Carly Beth has a worm put into her sandwich, and she, is humiliated in front of the whole school. And that was actually a real worm that she bit into, because she knew that if it was a fake worm, like she wasn't really going to be able to have the reaction that maybe they would have wanted. So they needed to have this, real worm. And they did it like 12 different times or some shit like that. It was crazy. But yeah. I mean, yeah, after watching the initial cut of the Haunted Mask, though, the broadcaster said we cannot put this onto TV because it's too scary. And in every Goosebumps episode, there's kind of an ironic twist at the end. And in the Haunted Mask, actually, it was going to be that the brother, and it still happens, the brother comes out wearing the mask, and then Carly Beth screams, and that was the end of the episode. And they just thought it was too scary. But they ended up doing a lot more mild form of that. But it's probably in a vault somewhere, but nobody will ever see it, though. And R.L. Stine is quoted as saying with Scholastic in 2012 that his favorite TV episode was The Haunted Mask. Like, the person playing Carly Beth was perfect. It's scary. The mask's horrifying and all this kind of stuff. With this premiere, this episode premiered October 27th of 1995. It was watched by almost 8 million households in the U.S. And it continued to be a hit when it was released on VHS the following year, which I definitely owned one. And I owned The Haunted Mask 2 as well. It sold nearly 3 million copies, and it was ranked by Billboard as the 75th best-selling home video of 1996. So it broke into the 100, which is pretty cool. Yeah. And Steve Levitan said that, like, we were expecting it to be really big when we got the rights to make the show. There were only about 8 or 10 books published, but they were growing, and they knew during shooting it was going to be huge. And before they went on air with Fox, they were selling 1 million a month. When the show started, it went to 5 million a month. So they knew that the series was becoming as popular, if not more so than the books. And Steve Levitan talks about how, like, he used to drop his kids off at school, and there'd always be about, like, 7 or 8 kids there wanting to talk about the show, because they knew that he was a part of it, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I mean, if anything, like, it's just, like, I don't know, this particular episode does talk about other stuff. Like, they do talk about Night in Terror Tower. They talk about just how this went on to this show became like a huge thing as well. And they talk about Slappy, of course, the king of Goosebumps, obviously. And how it just changed by the end as well. They changed that. But I really do think, like, even at the end of it all, they all talked about, like, how, for example, Amos Crawley talks about, like, he remembers having a really good time. Like, Tim Bond was awesome to work with. The other kids were awesome. There's conversations every now and then where people will be like, oh my God, I remember you. And you were, a kid, And he was also in, Amos Crawley, funny enough, him and Catherine Long were both in episodes of Are You Afraid of the Dark as well. Amos Crawley is in The Ghastly Grinner, and Catherine Long is in a later episode of the series of Are You Afraid of the Dark. I don't remember what it was called, but it was where she was doing Macbeth. I think it was her and Jay Baruchel, if I'm not mistaken. Canadians, what are you going to do? And, like, Catherine Long looks back and says, like, I always look back on Goosebumps very fondly. It set a work ethic precedent for me at a young age because it was demanding to film. It's great to know that it's something people fondly remember, and that there are things that define their childhoods, and Goosebumps define that for a lot of kids. And she always thought it would be, if they did another movie or in a one-time special, like, it'd be cool if she could come back maybe and do that. I would love that. Catherine Long, if this is really who you were, if this is your real words, I would love for you to come back. It'd be great. Yeah. And, like, Tim Bond, like, it was so long ago. It's funny how people keep a hold of Goosebumps, though. Like, through his agent, Tim Bond, he got a letter from an autistic, like, 26-year-old kid from Australia who's a fan. But, like, finding people who know who you are because of this, and how it's really just, even Steve Levitan talks about how, like, you know, it was a totally positive experience all the way through. It was fantastic coming to work every day and getting to hang out with like Billy Brown and Dan Angel. It wasn't that it wasn't stressful and there wasn't a lot of pressure, but it was a lot of fun, and they do it again, you know. So I think that's really cool that, you know, it seemed like it was a fun time on this set and to do this show in general, you know, because it was so important for people. And a little fun thing about Tim Bond, I forgot to mention it earlier, but Tim Bond, if you don't already know, he's a Canadian, but he actually was a part of writing a little horror movie from Canada from 1981 called Happy Birthday to Me. So that is the same guy who helped write it. It was him, and like, I think he was brought in for additional writing or something. I don't think he like literally wrote the whole story of Happy Birthday to Me, but like he was a part of that, which I thought was really interesting. And it's so funny when you watch these things. It's like, wow, I kind of get it though. I see it. And also I think Canada has that particular, like, especially with some of their horror movies they've done, they have this particular kind of look to them or to whatever, right? So, but yeah, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about all that fun stuff, you know. And we already talked a little bit about just like how with this was the first episode for this particular TV show, and that's very, very important. Very important. But yeah, I mean, it was just, I think if anything, just really solidified what this show could be, you know, and I think The Haunted Mask in particular really, really helped that, if anything. Talking about the themes of this, I'll talk about the themes of it, but the themes in this particular story are themes of peer taunting and family frustrations. The desire to fit in and peer pressure causes Carly Beth to behave in a disturbing manner because, according to Michelle Erica Green of FamilyWonder.com, she does not appreciate her positive qualities. A publication called Children's Video Report wrote that at its conclusion, Carly Beth has to, quote, learn to love and accept herself if she is to find happiness. And Scott Blakely from the Chicago Tribune stated that the episode reveals the dark side of childhood cruelty towards those who find themselves out of step with their peers or the in-group. And so, yeah, I mean, that's so super huge, you know, and then, of course, there were some people who said this was like hokey, you know, special effects were hokey. It had stereotypical characters and a corny feel-good message that was from same person who, you know, talked about Michelle Erica Green also talked about this, but then she also said that it was hokey and shit, which I get it. But like, I think if anything, like, I think the reason that this particular story just really, I think this particular story really resonates with people a lot of the time, is really because it's about somebody who's an outsider who really just wants to not be themselves in a way. I don't remember. Let me find it real quick. But there was an actual, let me look at this real quick. Hold on. There was an actual, there's a Medium article that is written by a author named Nora Neither Kaplan from 2017. And they talk about how their article is called Who I Used to Be, Self and Self-Loathing in The Haunted Mask. I'm not going to talk completely about that article. You can read it for yourself if you really want to. But they also talk about how this episode and this story in a way is a little bit like an allegory for transgender people, maybe, you know, or the feeling that transgender people have. And, you know, and this person in particular, I think this author is a trans person. But I thought that was really interesting to also, you know, talk about that as well, because I could see it. I can understand why, you know, queer people or gender nonconforming people in a way, can sort of, attach themselves to this story as well. I completely get it. And I think that's a reason why I particularly bonded with it too. Being somebody who was bullied and who was a little different or whatever, because of God knows everything. But like, I think that's exactly why I love this episode and this series a lot, and this particular episode was just so important because you see somebody who, it's similar to me with Carrie. I love Carrie because I love that Carrie gets to have her revenge, and in a way Carly Beth gets to have her revenge, but she also gets to learn how to appreciate herself and love herself, which is so super huge, I think. But I think that's exactly why people like this a lot. But we'll get into a little bit about exactly what Carly Beth and and friends deal with in this episode. So yeah, I mean, the basic plot of this story is Carly Beth Caldwell is repeatedly scared by two classmates, Chuck Green and Steve Boswell. And on Halloween, they fool her into eating a sandwich that contains a worm. And in anger, Carly Beth runs home and rips up a Doc costume made by her mother. And so she decides to go to a mask shop and hoping to find something that will scare Chuck and Steve. And so in the store, she finds a back room filled with some hideous masks. And the store's owner refuses to sell her any of the masks, so Carly Beth ends up stealing one and tosses money at the guy. And so at home, she uses the mask to frighten her brother Noah, and she has trouble taking the mask off, and when it finally comes off, she and Noah are unsure about how it unintentionally changed her voice. And after putting the mask on again, she takes a mold of the head that her mother made for her, and leaves the house to go meet her best friend, Sabrina Mason. And she's holding this head on like a broomstick, pretty much. Carly Beth then starts to act differently. She frightens other kids. She throws candy onto the ground and she destroys Halloween decorations. And after scaring Chuck and Steve in the Eda Grove Cemetery, she buries the mold of her head that her mom made. And so she runs back into the neighborhood, and she and Sabrina go back to her house, to Sabrina's house, and she is trying to take the mask off, and she is unable to remove this mask from, her face because it has become part of her skin. She then runs away and she runs back to the mask shop to find the owner waiting for her. And the shop owner tells her that Carly Beth that this is a real face. It's not actually a mask. And the only way to remove it is with a symbol of love. Carly Beth begins to cry out in horror, and it awakens the other masks, and they pretty much chase her into the cemetery. And what she does is she digs up the mold that her mother made her of her own face, and she, uses it to deter the other masks, and she's able to remove her mask at the end of the night. She then returns home, and she tosses the mask near the door, and she, talks how, she's learned a lot about herself tonight and everything, and then she's horrified to find out that her brother is actually now wearing the mask upon their return. And so that's the basic plot of this particular episode. But I really do think, I think the beginning part, really honestly, just all of the episode parts with Catherine Long in them are honestly the huge things for me that are so well done in this particular TV episode. The beginning where her and Sabrina, so she gets scared by Chuck and Steve in a pumpkin patch, and so her and Sabrina have this whole conversation about why do they do this to me, Sabrina? Why me? And say, don't worry, Carly Beth, it's just because you're so scareable, that's all. And a lot of it too, I think some people have also kind of talked about this as well, where it almost feels like Carly Beth has gone through some sort of abuse or something. I don't know, but her thing is that she's just so scared of everything. She's a scaredy cat, but that can also be something that maybe is a little bit deep-seated. It's just an anxious quality that she has. She just doesn't like to be scared. She doesn't like to be afraid. And people could definitely read into that of well, does she come from some sort of abuse? Has she experienced that in her life? What do we know? So it's And I think just the performance that Catherine Long gives is so strong. So like that, where she rips up the costume, I really think that was just a very strong scene as well, because she just cries. She is crying after being humiliated, and she rips this costume up that her mom worked so hard on, and like whatever. But you know what? Like sometimes it doesn't matter. Like, you know, when speaking for myself at least, like, yeah, when I would get bullied when I was a kid, like I would just sometimes just cry, and that's just what you do sometimes because you don't know how else to deal with it. And bullying can be very much something that affects you in your long-term life, and I think we're so aware of that now, but like back in the 90s, it was a little different, and really it's still something that's so important to just be aware of, that you shouldn't bully people. You shouldn't bully people in school. You shouldn't bully people at work, because it's never going to be good for anybody. But yeah, I mean, I just think that it's just trying to show that, like, hey, you know what? Like, I want to get revenge. And also revenge is just something that, like, a kid wanting to get revenge on other kids, and yeah, I mean, I think that's also a kind of mature-ish theme as well, kind of, Yeah, so many of these scenes with her in it. I love the scene as well where, it's her like scaring Chuck and Steve in the cemetery, because she's just like, yeah, it's creepy, man. But I love the scene as well where she's at Sabrina's house. And you can find it on YouTube, of course. You can find this particular scene where she's trying to take the mask off and she's freaking out, and she goes up, and I still think it's really creepy and scary for a kid, especially, where she goes up and she has this. They also use like some like first person views in this particular episode as well, which I thought was really cool and interesting. But they go to the mirror in Sabrina's house, and she looks down her collarbone, her décolletage, if you will, and she sees, oh no, Sabrina, there's no line here, and then Sabrina's just like, I'm going to tell my mom, because when you're 12, like, what else are you going to do? And then when she says, when Carly Beth says, those eyes in the mirror, and she's like, what about them? And then she's like, those aren't my eyes, Sabrina. My eyes don't look like that. And then Carly Beth just says, those aren't my eyes. Where are my eyes? Where am I? And then Sabrina just says, you're scaring me. And then she's like, this isn't me. This isn't me in here. And it's all these things of just like, it's so freaky for a kid. I'm just saying, like, oh, it still gives me a little bit of goosebumps, whatever. Like, but it does. Like, it's very crazy and creepy, and oh my god, like that would be scary for any. It's the thing with the eyes for me, where she says, those aren't my eyes. My eyes don't look like that. Like, so it's imagining that, like, you have this mask on, and you don't even recognize yourself. You don't even recognize your own eyes because they're different. And it's fucking creepy. So like, oh, anyway, so I love that. And, and also, like, when she goes back to the shop and she has the conversation with the shop owner and all this, she has that scene where she looks in the mirror and she's crying and she screams, and I think Catherine Long did such a good goddamn job at this so well. Like, she did so good, and I feel for her with her 90s bob. I love it, and it's just one of these things where I am, yeah. I love the fact that this story, it's her having this whole arc, and really at the end of it, she becomes a changed person, and it really is just about like self-love and self-actualization, if you will, growing as a person, and all of this. I just really love that. And I think that this particular TV episode of this show, I mean, it really set the precedent for the rest of the series moving forward. it felt a little different. It felt like an experience, you know what I mean? And so like, I think that was so super huge. And I think this particular episode of the show is one that is so memorable to people because of that very fact of that. I think it was, in a way, yeah, it's hokey by today's standards or whatever, but the message that we still have of it, I think is really which is why people love it so much. The themes that are in it are still things that are pervasive in our particular society anyway. It's stuff that doesn't go away. The challenge to love yourself and to be able to have self-esteem and being able to do all of that is still something people deal with every day. So I think that's something that's hugely a part of this story, very, very big. But I think that's exactly why it stays around, because you can still show a kid this. It still spooks them and scares them, but I also think like it teaches them that at the end of the day, you have to, love who you are and love your own self. And, even if you're being picked on or bullied, you have to be able to try to have that sense of self-love or sense of self-esteem, because if you don't, you can fall victim to something like the haunted mask, really. So I don't know. I just think like, I mean, again, it's a chapter book for preteens. So like, like whatever, there's always so much depth to it. But I think the reason that this has been something so important for kids, and something that is just so, important for children's horror, especially is just the fact that this was the precedent that was set, and then moving forward, like you can't touch it really. And then the fact of having something like this new TV show, for, Goosebumps, which I don't really know about it. I haven't watched it or anything. I'm recording this a little early in advance, so, it hasn't come out quite yet, but, I don't have high hopes, but whatever, I might be wrong. But anyway, yeah, I just think like this particular episode of TV, I think, was such a huge thing for children's horror, and I'm always very interested, as somebody who does not want children. It's not like I don't like kids, but like I'm not, I don't know, like just not my target demographic, you know what I mean? Like I'm not like, whatever, they're fine, but like but I think it's important as somebody like myself who, I grew up then having an appreciation for horror and wanting to seek it out. Do you know what I mean? And this particular TV episode really did that for me, as a kid. And, I mean, and I think it did that for a lot of kids too. And I really think that it's important to keep, children's horror alive, and we're lucky to have like, things like, Are You Afraid of the Dark, and, the Goosebumps TV show, you have the Goosebumps movies, and like, other things like Coraline and like Hocus Pocus and things like this that are able to kind of keep that tradition alive, because I just want to make sure that that is something that is accessible. 'Cause it is something that people really can enjoy and love at a young age. And it can then inform them of what they may want to do with the rest of their lives. Like maybe you go and you want to be like a special effects artist because you love horror movies, or maybe you want to go and be an actor or a writer because you're like, oh my God, I love those TV episodes and I wished I could act in them, or, oh, I could have written an episode that I thought was really good that I had an idea about, or whatever. As I don't know how much I mentioned it on the podcast, but like, films are so super important, and especially with films that you see as a kid or TV episodes that you see as a kid, those have a huge impact on you. And so I think this one definitely had a huge impact on me, which is why I'm talking about it. But really, I just think like in the spirit of Halloween, in the spirit of Samhain, if you will, Samhain. But I think that this particular episode of TV is so super integral to that. It has become kind of a yearly watch for me around this time. So I'm definitely probably watching it today. But I do think it's so super important, and I always want to champion the fact that it's important to have these kinds of things out there for kids, for young people to enjoy, that are age appropriate. I also did want to get on my little soapbox earlier and talk about book banning and how challenged books are kind of a so super antiquated idea, and I do not agree with that at all. And I really just think that it's not up to a library to just censor things that you may not like. It is a library's job to be able to disseminate information out to the masses and to be able to curate literature and information. That is what a library is there to do. That is why that's important, because, as history will show, that at a time, the people in power, the oligarchy, whatever you want to call it, the elite, if you will, they've wanted to keep, print from people. They've wanted to keep print from the peons, if you will, or whatever you want to call it. But this is important. And to talk about something like Goosebumps, you have to talk a little bit about book censorship and book banning and all that kind of stuff, because it is a part of that conversation. So I did want to also talk about that as well, because I think it's, because I think back to that guy that, I inserted that clip about earlier, that really at the end of the day, it's really all about just you want your kid to turn out better than you did, and you want them to do better than you are doing, and whether or not you like the content of something or whatever, I'd rather somebody like what they're reading than not. And if that instills an interest for reading and an interest for literacy, and it helps set them up to be able to get a good education so that they can actually do something with their lives, great. And I think the fact that gentleman from earlier, in that little clip I had, the fact that he is somebody who even says, I don't have a good education, I don't have these things, I don't have the time to read to my daughter, but I just want her to be able to set up to be able to get an education so that she doesn't end up like me with no education and no good job or whatever. I mean, and you could go into the weeds about book banning and, book burning and all this kind of stuff, right? And book censorship in general. Like I said, check out that Judy Blume documentary. It does talk about that as well. And even in the little documentary about scary stories, they talk about how people get so impassioned about that. But I mean, I get it. I get that you don't want your kid exposed to certain things, or you may not agree with certain things that are in literature or whatever the hell. But guess what? That's your job as the parent to be aware of that. That's what that is. So, oh God, I really could go on all about that. We could have a whole conversation. Maybe we will. Who knows? Maybe I'll get a little symposium together and talk about that, because it's just something that's so frustrating. But it is something that happens. And the same thing goes with films, of course. And we can get into all about that with films as well. But but I think that at the end of the day, to kind of wrap up a little bit, I think with this particular episode of TV, the Goosebumps Haunted Mask, of Goosebumps, the Haunted Mask, I really do think this particular episode did such a number on me, if you will. But it is the first piece of horror media that I saw that really affected me, that I really enjoyed, that I loved watching, and I really liked. And it really set me up to be a fan of horror throughout my life, you know, and I'm so happy for it. And I'm glad that, you know, I'm hoping that R.L. Stine has a good bag of money for what he's done. You know, hopefully, dear God, I hope. But like, you know, I'm just glad that this exists out there, that it's out there for the young horror fans. If you're listening to this and you're a fan of this too, shout out, you know, because I love it too. And I know that, you know, if you're listening to this and you like it, I know that you probably understand that, like, there is this kind of deeper story in The Haunted Mask that maybe some of the other episodes of Goosebumps didn't always have, you know. And so I think that's why this resonates with people a lot, and it resonates with people like you who are listening. And I just appreciate you coming to listen to this today, because this is deeply personal for me, and it's a deeply important piece of media for me to talk about. But, you know, I don't mean to get all deep and sappy or whatever, but yeah, I mean, it's super big, and I'm glad to be able to share it and talk about it. And I think it's so perfect for the season. I hope you all have had like an enjoyable spooky season. I hope it's been good to you. I hope you've watched a lot of spooky things, scary movies, whatever you do. And if anything, I wish you all the best, and I wish you a very nice and happy Halloween, and be sure to tune in for my next episode. Thank you so much, and happy Halloween, everybody. Take care. Bye.